what you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. I am your host Mike, and on tonight's show we've got a returning guest. His name is Matt Sergiou. Matt was somebody who joined me for multiple episodes in the early days of the podcast, so it's really exciting to have him back on the show. And on tonight's show, we're going to be picking back up where we left off in our previous conversations, discussing how the counterculture in Great Britain was used as a form of social engineering. And tonight's episode, which is specifically about the Beatles and even more specifically about John Lennon, well, let's just say it's going to blow your mind. Matt has done some fantastic research that essentially suggests that potentially John Lennon and his entire life and his career with the Beatles was one big, I don't know, we could call it a magic spell or some kind of psyop or social engineering project. Let's leave it there for the introduction. There's a lot to get into in tonight's episode, and I think you're going to love this one. I certainly enjoyed making it, so let's get to it. Members, please head over to parallelmike.com to sign in and listen to the full show. And if you're not a member yet, but you do enjoy the podcast, well, you can support me and the content and access part number 2 of each and every episode over on parallelmike.com. In closing, I hope you're all well, healthy, and reasonably happy, and I'll see you in the next one. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. We are joined by a returning guest, Matt Sergiou of the Occult Beatles and also Conspiro TV. Matt, you are one of the most frequently returning guests, although we haven't spoken for about a year or so. You was actually on episode 23, 35, and 43, and you really helped the podcast, in my opinion, because those early episodes was where we went into this idea that the counterculture was a big social engineering project. And you was the guy who did so much research on that. And then you brought it to the listeners, really helped me in the show to kind of frame some of the later episodes. So a big thank you for that, Matt. And I'm really excited to have you back on the show. And the reason I asked you back is you uploaded a new video to your YouTube channel, link in the description. And it was titled Mind Control, Magic Mysteries and Machinations. And just before we started this one, I said to you, I just couldn't believe the depth of research that you went into in this. It was about John Lennon and Yoko Ono and also the Beatles too, but you was talking about the occult link-ups, and basically you go into their lives and all of the different weird esoteric practices and the astrologers and the Egyptian mummies that they were bringing across is wild. And we're going to get into that tonight because I think it's going to help put, I would say, a microscope on what's happening in these circles, in the, we could call it the elites, but I would say this is more to do with culture and how that's being used to shape society. So very excited for this one, Matt. But before we get started, how are things going? It's been a little while since we last spoke.
Well, hello. And again, thank you very much for having me on. How's it been going? Well, I've been keeping busy, to the point where I don't know which way to turn next. I've got so many ideas for video presentations to release on Conspiro TV, my YouTube channel, and articles as well, whether it be on my website, Conspiro Media, or the Occult Beatles. Just so many ideas and so many ideas that haven't come into fruition in any shape or form. I've also got projects which I'm working on. I'm researching and scripting as we speak, pretty much as we speak. And it's just finding the time to get it all out there, finding the time in between living a quote unquote regular life where you have to go out and earn a living and run your errands, your daily errands and family life and what have you, kind of organizing all of that. And at the same time, getting all this material out that I've got. And I've got so much material that still hasn't come out yet. And it's just, yeah, I've been keeping busy and keeping busy, trying to keep well, eat healthily as well as I can, exercise, do my half an hour every day, just plodding along, soldiering on.
Well, that's good to hear, Matt. It's good to hear that you are managing to do all the other stuff on top of the research. I can kind of imagine that someone doing that amount of research has to lock themselves away in a basement for 5 months, because it's just, like I said, that video that you just did, the depth was crazy. And as I was watching it, I was like, surely he's not going to be able to find anything else. And then you'd produce another rabbit out of the hat and another one and another one. And listeners, you've got to check that one out, but we will go through a lot of it in this episode too. When we're talking about occult link-ups, this is more than just, they put Aleister Crowley on the front of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts. It's like, no. It's way beyond that. We're talking about rituals, hypnotists, esoteric advisors, mummies being brought across from Egypt. And then at the center of it all, there is that really strange character. She's still alive today. Her name is Yoko Ono. Let's start there, Matt. Who was she really? What kind of spiritual and mystical ideas shaped her worldview? What did she bring to the table in terms of John Lennon and the Beatles?
Well, I don't think it's too much of a secret that she's into, quote unquote, esoterica, into the occult. It's quite well documented, and she herself has talked about it over the years. It's no great, massive secret. Before I go into that, just a quick look at her background, her family background, her bloodline, as it were. And I do mention this in the video, so I won't go into too much detail. I'll leave folks to go take a look at the video where I go into it a little bit. I don't go too much into it, but basically, just to give you a kind of a sketch, if you like, of her background, her family background, invariably when us so-called alternative researchers look into the machinations of the so-called elites or people that we find to be suspicious, we find that they have this quote-unquote elite background, this elite bloodline. And Yoko Ono is absolutely no exception to that, both on her mother and father's side. I think it's on her mother's side, although doing this off memory, so do forgive me. I research so much and I've packed in so much information in my brain that I sometimes forget stuff. I think it's on her mother's side. She's related to what was one of Japan's, because she hails from Japan, of course, what was Japan's most powerful bank, which was the Yasuda Bank. Her family, I think it was her grandfather or a great-grandfather, I think, was the founder of it. And on her father's side, I think she has links to the samurai and also to the royal family, Japanese royal family as well. So this isn't some ordinary lady, let's put it like that. She's not your regular person on the street, as it were. But yeah, in terms of the occult and esoterica, Yoko Ono is no stranger to it. For example, she's into numerology. It's no secret that she, over the years, consults numerologists when it comes, before she makes a big decision in her life, whether it's a business decision, because she for the last 40 or 50 or so years, she took a lot of the Lennon profits from the Beatles and his solo career and invested that in various avenues like property and what have you. And before she goes ahead and makes decisions like that, she has a team of numerologists and astrologers who will guide her about what path to take. This is no secret. She's spoken about it herself. People who know her very well have spoken about it as well. And I'm going to read you a few little bits of quotes here from a book. And this isn't actually mentioned in the video that we've talked about. And this is from a guy by the name of Elliot Mintz. Now, Elliot Mintz is basically Yoko Ono's official spokesperson. So he will give you the official narrative to the John and Yoko story. Okay, so it's very sanitized. And he's been Yoko Ono's official spokesman since John Lennon was killed in 1980. They first met, John and Yoko first met Elliot Mintz back in 1971, I think it was. He was a radio DJ at the time, and he's now like this PR consultant. And one of the people that he handles is Paris Hilton, which is a bit weird when you think John Lennon. Okay, so he's friends with John Lennon. He was friends with John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And then on the other side of the spectrum, he's handling the career of Paris Hilton. I mean, how sort of on one side of the spectrum to the other, how far can you get? But he recently released his memoirs.
Sorry to interrupt, Matt, but I never knew this guy till you mentioned him in your research. And the first thing I found on Wikipedia was that his first ever interview was just after the death of JFK, because amazingly, he happened to know a schoolboy friend of the supposed killer, Lee Harvey Oswald. And I was like, yeah, that just doesn't seem right to me.
That's weird in itself, isn't it? Again, one of the clues that we get when we look at the so-called elites or people close to them is these quote unquote, what's the word? Not synchronicities, coincidences, that they seem to have these great coincidences that help them along in life. And yeah, like you say, Elliot Mintz, when he was at media college, when he was a teenager, in 1963, there he is, JFK is shot, it's on the news. And he's in a cafe, in the college cafe, or in their makeshift studio, because he's a media student. They're watching the TV, they're watching the news reports as they're coming in, as it's happening. And all of a sudden, one of his friends who's at the college jumps up out of his chair, an ex-Marine or something, and he goes, I know him, I know that guy. And they're showing a photograph on the TV of Oswald. And he goes, I know that guy, I know him, I know him. And Elliot Mintz thinks, how fortuitous, and records an interview with this guy that's in the college. But within the end of the day, it's been broadcast on the major TV networks across the US. Yeah, so, you know, you know, what a coincidence, eh? But Elliot Mintz last year in 2024, he released his memoirs. I can't remember the name of the memoirs offhand. I think it's We All Shine On, John, Yoko, and Me. And with regards to Yoko and the occult, he goes into it quite a bit, actually, about Yoko and John's practice of the occult, numerology, for example. And he says that they had a team of astrologers and numerologists who would guide them through life. For example, if they were to take a plane journey from one part of the US to another, they would consult their team of astrologers and numerologists to tell them when was the best day to go, what path to take, and so on. So yeah, in these memoirs, there's a rather interesting, well, it's quite an interesting book in a lot of respects, but there's this interesting part where this is some years, I think, after John and Yoko have moved into the Dakota apartment building in New York. They moved in there in 1973, and it was some years later in 1980. This is where John Lennon was shot. And Yoko Ono carried on living there up until about 2 years ago, I think.
That's strange in and of itself.
And
that the place he got shot, she continued to live there. There was no trauma attached to it. It was like, I'm happy to stay here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad you mentioned that. I was going to, and I thought I better not. I'll because otherwise I'll go off into another tangent. But yeah, absolutely. So over the years, since they moved in 1973, they've been buying parts of the apartment block. So their apartment, which was kind of regular sized, over the years has grown and grown and grown. And I think they had maybe 1 or 2 floors, but don't quote me on that. But they've been acquiring spaces to make it bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, according to Elliot Mintz in his memoirs, Yoko found out, she discovered a rumor that that an elderly lady who lived in the apartment next door to them was going to sell it. And John and Yoko were keen to expand. Now, this hadn't been advertised. This hadn't been made public. They just heard a rumor. Yoko heard a rumor that this elderly lady wanted to sell. Now, according to Elliot, she somehow managed to acquire a key for the apartment. And he doesn't say in his memoirs how she did this, but she managed to acquire a key for the apartment. And one day when the elderly lady was out, she broke in. She took the key and she went into the apartment with John and Elliot Mintz. Now, one of the creepy things about this, apart from going into the actual apartment, is how did she know that the elderly lady had left the apartment? What was she doing? Was she watching? Was she kind of stalking her? I find that a bit weird. So they walk. To quote Elliot in the memoirs, he says to Yoko, look, if you want the place, why don't you just make an offer? Why are you doing this? Why are we in here? And she said to him, yes, but before I make an offer, I have to find the best way to make that offer. And with this, Elliot claims in his memoirs, Yoko reached into her bag and took out a candle, some crystals, and a deck of tarot cards and placed them on the nearby coffee table in this elderly lady's apartment. And Mintz quotes her as saying in his memoirs, "We must find a way of getting her to want us to sell the apartment. Otherwise, she might sell it to someone else who makes a better offer." And Mintz then claims that Yoko lit the candle, rubbed the crystals between her fingers for a few minutes, then spent some time turning over tarot cards and studying them. And then she closed her eyes and then blew out the candle. And then they all left the apartment. 2 weeks later, the apartment was theirs. Elliot says he got a call from John Lennon saying, "We've done it. We've got it." So make of that what you will. And yeah, and also in his memoirs, you mentioned mummies, Egyptian mummies, I think you said. And in Elliot Mintz's memoirs, he talks about going into the Dakota one day into the apartment, and he sees a sarcophagus in the apartment, a 3,000-year-old sarcophagus, basically a mummy. So she actually is very interested in investing in ancient Egyptian artifacts. Now, in the memoirs, Elliot says to Yoko, he suggested to her, he said to her, "Why don't you get this x-rayed? Because there might be some valuable trinkets or jewels encased within this sarcophagus." And she said, "No. I don't care what's inside." And again, I'm quoting from Mintz's memoirs. She said to him, "I don't care what's inside. The great value is the magic of the mummy itself." And I've got a quote here, and I think I do mention this in the video that we talked about earlier. In an interview in 1980, she said, "To make money, you have to spend money. But if you're going to make money, you have to make it with love. I love Egyptian art. I make sure to get all the Egyptian things, and not for their value, but for their magic power. Each piece has a certain magic power." They've also been to Egypt. I mean, there's photographs of John and Yoko in Egypt in the late 1970s, standing outside or beside in the distance. You can see behind them the pyramids of Giza. And there is an allegation, a claim, which has never been substantiated in another book, a quote unquote unofficial book based on the lost Lennon diaries that were stolen from Lennon's apartment, if I'm not mistaken. There's claims that Yoko received notification that there was some ancient Egyptian artifacts that were that she could get her hands on if she were to make it over to Egypt forthwith. And at the time, the Egyptian government was putting a clamp down on people just going over there and and getting their hands on this stuff. And she basically, according to this book, the claim is that she flew over with John to Egypt in order to begin a clandestine operation in order to get hold of these ancient Egyptian artifacts without the Egyptian government knowing about it. But it never happened. Apparently, everyone got the people surrounding her got a little bit jittery, so it never actually happened in the end. They went over to Egypt, but the operation, as it were, this undercover operation to get this stuff out of Egypt and over to America didn't materialize in the end. But yeah, it's absolutely no secret at all. Yoko's fascination with esoterica, the occult, and ancient Egyptian artifacts. I think if you look online, there's actually a photograph that I've come across. There may be more, but I've come across at least one photograph where you see Yoko Ono sitting in what looks like a living room, and behind her you can see what looks like an ancient Egyptian artifact. I don't know if it's a mummy. I can't quite remember now, but yeah, no secret at all.
Yeah, I was just trying to find that image. Matt, I'll have a look whilst you're answering the next question. But, it's easy to write this kind of stuff off as eccentric celebrity behavior. But there's actually a pattern. It's organized, it's ritualistic, and wherever you look with these elites or blue blood families, you find this throughout history. The Knights Templar used to have mummified heads, which they would worship. They'd call it Baphomet, and they'd do rituals to try and increase their wealth through the head was the thing. So kind of like Yoko Ono said, it's not about that being valuable. It's that using this in a ritual can bring me some kind of magical powers. So is there anything to suggest that these things were being used in rituals? Was John Lennon involved in these rituals, or was it kind of exclusive to Yoko Ono?
I haven't come across anything to do with rituals. No, not as such. No.
But you
I
did
haven't.
mention that John Lennon was into the astrologers too, and that he had kind of people that he would bring in to give him guidance and advice. So there is some kind of surface level stuff, I guess. What do we know about John Lennon's interest in that side of life?
Oh, where do I begin? Well, I'll show you the book. If people are watching this in vision, if they're not just hearing the audio, I'll show you the book. The book that actually inspired me to make this Mind Games video that you can find on my YouTube channel. This is the book. Here it is. It's about 300 pages long or something like that. And it was released in 2024, kind of around summer to early winter time, to coincide with the re-release of John Lennon's 1973 solo album, Mind Games. And this book, which I'm holding here in front of me, was released about a month afterwards to kind of accompany it. But it's an unusual book. I'm just putting it down, sorry. It's an unusual book in the sense that it's not what you would call a traditional book which ties in with the making of an album. What you would expect, what I was expecting, was a book which is looking at the making of the album and nothing else. But so interviews with the musicians who played on it, the story of how it came to be, the meanings behind the songs, the lyrics and the musicality of it, the album art, and so on and so on, that kind of stuff. But what I realized when I looked into the book and what inspired me to make this video that I put up on YouTube is that it goes into much, much more than that. Things that don't actually have anything to do with the album, really. It talks about it gives you John and Yoko's life from about 1970-71 to until the album is actually made, and the aftermath of that, the reception to it, and so on. So it's kind of like the life story of John and Yoko, the early years from just post-Beatles split, 1970-71, up until the making of the album. And what makes this unusual is that it's going into stuff that doesn't have any relevance to the album. As I was saying, things about the occult. There are sections in the book. There's a section in the book which is about 20 or so pages long, which is under the subtitle of Some Call It Magic. And it's basically looking into John and Yoko's, but mostly John's interest in the esoteric and the occult. So there's pages there on the I Ching. There's pages on numerology. There's pages on his association with the Maharishi, with the Beatles back in the 60s, and Buddhism and so-called Eastern mysticism and meditation, transcendental meditation. And what I found quite astonishing in a way is that this is an officially sanctioned book. It's credited to John and Yoko Ono. And inside this book, it makes references within that 20-page sort of area, and then some. It also mentions it on other pages. References to Crowley, references to magic with a K. And I was really quite astonished to see a officially sanctioned book where John Lennon, there's actual there's actual pages and bits of notepaper and diary entries from John Lennon's archive featured in this book, in which we see him scribbling the word magic. He's practicing numerology. He's writing his name out and then looking at the numerological values of his name. So you see bits of notepaper where he's scribbling out his name, and then he's got the numerological meaning to that. And then next to it, he's scribbled down the name of Aleister Crowley, and he's doing numerological calculations of that as well, and the word magic and so on. And I was quite, because up until this stage, I think most researchers who've looked into the occult side of the Beatles and the music industry of John Lennon, a lot of what's been said about the Beatles and John Lennon and Crowley and so on has been kind of theory. It's been alleged. It's been kind of guesswork. But when you look in this book, I think I came away with it. I came away from it with absolutely no doubt in my mind that John Lennon was a follower of Crowley and the occult, because it's there in front of you. You've got John Lennon scribbling away in his own handwriting, Crowley, magic, and he's talking about it in interviews as well. I mean, where do I start? Where do I start with this?
And these books were books related to, like you said, esotericism, but there were some really rare books in there about, why Jesus Christ wasn't really the Messiah. He was a prophet. I would say these books that were trying to create the new age and take humanity from the classical understanding of God and religion to something much more occulted and spurious. And today we've got that stuff en masse. It's all across society, and we've got all kinds of psychedelics coming back into the fold. And you can kind of see that was the objective. And I would say it seems to me like he was not just curious about that stuff, but he was like heavily involved in it.
Yeah.
And your recent video, that it kind of blew my mind, because I knew some of it, but I just didn't realize the depth of it till I saw that video.
I had inklings, I had suspicions. Like I say, a lot of researchers that look at this kind of thing have had an inkling, have had a suspicion, looking at clues, quote unquote, in album covers of the Beatles and so on, that there was something funny going on, a little bit, But yeah, this book, just like, it's just in your face, really. I mean, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about the section in the book which is under the subtitle. Within that, some call it magic area in the book, there's a subtitle which is, and it's John and Yoko's Library of Esoterica, a selection. And it's it's 2 pages long, 4 pages all in all. And it's a list of some of the books that John and Yoko have read. Now, just a quick sort of, just to point out here that it doesn't state in the book which of these books John read and which ones Yoko read. So you kind of have to sort of guess. But yeah, I'm just looking at it right now, this list. We've got books about theosophy, about Helena Blavatsky. We've got books about the Kabbalah. We've got a book called Satanism and Witchcraft. We've got loads of books about astrology, numerology, Chinese fortune telling, the tarot. I'm just having a quick scan through here. Also telepathy. What else have we got here? Let's just I'm having a quick look here. Yeah, Buddhism, transcendental meditation. Yeah, and the book that you're talking about is The Myth of God Incarnate, which is a book featuring articles by various theologians and professors challenging the idea that Jesus was incarnate, that basically this was something that it's an invention, basically, which is quite a controversial idea, I suppose. So yeah, if there's one of the quotes that's in the book is actually to do with one of the songs on the Mind Games album, and I've got it here somewhere. I've got a table which is strewn with bits of paper and notes and quotations, because there's so much to remember.
Even the title of the album, Mind Games, and I know we're going to get into this later on, but there is a strong suggestion, at least, potentially you could say there's a good bit of evidence that John Lennon was actually under some kind of mind control, that there was hypnotism happening on him. Maybe he was a part of an MK Ultra program. And I think when you link all of these things that you've been researching together, it has all the hallmarks of that, you could say. So even the title of this album being Mind Games, it's just, interesting to me.
Yeah, it's based on a book which was helped into fruition by about 3 doctors that I'm aware of, 3 psychiatrists who are linked or were linked to the CIA and MK Ultra. But with regards to magic, John Lennon's references to it, which you can see him scribbling it down in the book. With regards to magic, of course, just to give you a quick summary of the word magic, this is magic spelt Magick. To quote Crowley, because he was the one that championed this word, I found myself at a loss for a name to designate my work. I chose, therefore, the name Magic with a K, as essentially the most sublime and actually the most discredited of all the available terms. I must make magic the essential factor in the life of all. I must then explain and justify my position by formulating a definition of magic and setting forth its main principles in such a way that all may understand instantly that their souls their lives in every relation with every other human being and every circumstance depend upon magic and the right comprehension and right application thereof. Definition: magic is the science, and that's with a K, magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. Now, the actual title track, Mind Games, the song, it was a song by John Lennon, and of course it was also the title of the album. There's a piece in the verse to the lyrics of Mind Games which goes like this. It goes, "We're playing those mind games together, pushing the barriers, planting seeds, playing the mind gorilla, chanting the mantra, peace on earth. We all been playing those mind games forever. Some kind of druid dudes lifting the veil, doing the mind gorilla. Some call it magic, the search for the grail." Now, in the official lyrics, the word magic in there is spelt in the traditional way, Magic. But when you look in the Mind Games book, it's got a lyric sheet which is typed out. And I'm guessing this is the lyric sheet that would have been sitting on the music stand in the studio for the musicians to play along to. And where it gets to the word magic typed out, it's in pencil. Somebody has added the letter K. So whether that's John, I would assume it was John. But in the official lyrics, once it came out, that K was dropped and it was just the traditional spelling of it.
And it seems to me, from what you're saying, like John and Yoko had a really extensive knowledge of this stuff, like not just playing around in your bedroom kind of knowledge. It's like, no, they've been...
It seems that way, yeah.
Almost like, I would say they've been, I wouldn't say illuminated, but definitely brought into some society, potentially some secret society. Or maybe it was just Yoko with her bloodline. Maybe it was transmitted down from her parents and she just continued it.
Well, in the Mind Games book, there's an interview that there's various excerpts of interviews that they gave over the years. And she claims that she didn't get into astrology and numerology until she met John Lennon. That's what she claims in the book.
But is it right that they had their son as well? Like she planned out exactly to the date that she wanted to have her son. I heard this before, that she was using numerology and astrology to make sure he was born on a set day.
Yeah, that's what's been said. Yeah, I don't know if that's been officially given the thumbs up. I think it might have been, but nevertheless, yes, John Lennon was born on October the 9th, 1940, and Sean, his second son, was born on October the 9th, 1975. Yeah, so there is this claim that it was planned that way and that it was delivered by a cesarean section so that it could be, delivered on that specific date. I think the claim is that Yoko wanted John and his son to share the same birthday. I think that's the quote that's been used. But yeah, but and as you say, you talk about John using magic with regards to the Mind Games album. Applying magic to the music and this album and the song Mind Games. Indeed, if you look in the John and Yoko book, where he's tinkering around with numerology on these bits of notepaper, where you see him scribble his name and then put the numerological equalization of what that means, in terms of numbers. It looks like he's trying to work out numerologically how to record the album, when to record it, when to release it, because in amongst all these bits of notepaper, you can see titles of the songs, you can see the Mind Games album is noticed, the record label is mentioned. So it looks like he's planning the journey of the album and how to make it and how to release it and when to release it on his practice of numerology and also the I Ching as well. And with regards to Crowley, there's a song on the album which is called Bring on the Lucy, Free the People. I'm assuming that this song is a protest song. And I'm presuming it's a protest song about then US President Richard Nixon, who John was not fond of. And it's since come out in documents under freedom of information that Nixon and his people were monitoring Lennon via the FBI, and they were seeking to throw John out of the US to deport him. When John moved to the States in 1971, he wanted to live there, and the US immigration services were trying to throw him out because they saw him as a threat, because he was so influential to the younger person thanks to his fame in the Beatles, and he was being so vocal against the Vietnam War and the Nixon administration that they were trying to throw him out. And freedom of information records have in more recent decades since John died have confirmed that he suspected that when he was alive, but he couldn't prove it. He suspected that his phones were being tapped and so on. But yeah, so I'm assuming that this song, Bring On the Lucy, Free the People, is a reaction to that on the part of John. It's an anti-Nixon song. For example, there's a lyric in the song where he sings, "You're making all our decisions. We have just one request of you, that while you're thinking things over, here's something you just better do. Free the people now. Do it, do it, do it, do it." And then later he sings, "You think you're cool and know what you're doing. 666 is your name." Now, when he was asked about the song, he said, and I quote, what does it mean? What the hell does it mean? I keep asking myself, but how the hell should I know? It's just something that came into my head. Lucy is just one of those things after Lucy in the Sky. Lucy keeps staying in my head. The lyrics, have been around a long time. I just never put them on paper. It's in the Bible, isn't it? The great beast, 666. The reason it actually cropped up is because I had all my books sent from England, and I had a few by Aleister Crowley that I'd had for years. He was just in my consciousness at the time. So again, in this book, you're getting, this is an official book, so you can't say that these quotes from Lennon are claimed or alleged to be quotes from Lennon. They're in an official John Lennon book. So they are from John Lennon. This is, officially sanctioned stuff. So yeah, and then you look at the Beatles' career, and Crowley just does keep popping up here and there and everywhere, whether it's in your face or whether it's a little bit more sort of underhand, if you like. But yeah.
And do we have any evidence, Matt, that John Lennon was under any kind of psychic or hypnotic influence in that last decade of his life? Because it seems to me like Yoko Ono, she seems to be almost, I would say, the one in the driving seat of this occultism. And when you talk about John Lennon and his kind of esoteric practices, it almost feels like, if we understand it as there's black magicians and there's white magicians, it seems to me like he was trying to use his esoteric knowledge for good because he wanted to stop the war. Certainly, he would have been somebody that the establishment would want pushing their agendas because he could indoctrinate the youth and get them to go along with the agenda. But he wasn't. He was going the opposite way. He was anti-war. So he was the enemy of the state. He did eventually get killed, and there's a lot we could discuss on that. But is there any evidence that he was being worked on through Yoko Ono or anyone else, hypnotists or psychics, that were maybe trying to influence him to go another direction?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's not a very popular point of view, but certainly it hasn't been vocalized in any great way, shape, or form by so-called alternative researchers, people that are in our sort of orbit. What I would agree with is it looks quite likely, in my eyes, that the Beatles were social engineers. Whether they knew it, whether they were conscious of it or not, they were there to socially engineer. My view, which isn't echoed in our kind of orbit, as I say so much, is that I'm putting it forward as a proposition, as a possibility, as something to think about in the video, is what if John, yes, was a social engineer when he was with the Beatles, but at some point, and I think I would put George Harrison into this as well, because in some ways he's more in your face with it than John ever was. But that's another subject for another time. But I'm putting forward the idea that maybe, yes, John was a social engineer in the 60s with the Beatles, but maybe somewhere towards the late 60s and then into the 70s, he was trying to atone for that by going rogue, if you like, by doing what he was doing, which ended up with the FBI following him, monitoring him, the CIA, MI5 as well, apparently in the UK, and which led to his very, very suspicious death. What if he was trying to atone for his past sins, for want of a better word? And what if, because of this, there were people in his orbit, around his orbit, and I go into this in great detail in the video, people that were placed there to make sure that they could misdirect him, to take those good intentions and to make him turn his attention towards projects that he might have thought were effective in fighting against the so-called establishment, but were actually detrimental, were actually backfiring, but he wouldn't have realized it at the time. Maybe people placed their so-called friends and associates and what have you to misdirect him, to get him to put his energies towards something where it's going to end up being a dead end. And with regards to mind control, certainly, I mean, I could take it right back to when he first kind of met Yoko Ono. They're said to have first met in 1966. And by 1968, they were involved in a relationship. At the time, John was married to his first wife, Cynthia, who he first met in his pre-Fame days in Liverpool. And they had a child together, Julian. And Yoko was married at the time as well to a guy by the name of Anthony Cox, who, again, if you look into his past, raises some eyebrows. It does for me anyway. Now, there's something that I mentioned in the video. There's a passage in Cynthia's book, which is just plainly titled John. It's basically her memoirs. And what happened basically was, if I'm not mistaken, John and Yoko, Cynthia was away on vacation abroad, and she came home to find Yoko dressed in Cynthia's nightgown, in her kind of robes, in her bedroom. And she thought, oh, okay, all right, I get, okay. Apparently, Cynthia just turned around and walked out of the house and just left them to it. Now, some time after this, maybe it was a few weeks after this, Cynthia took her son Julian with her when she left the house, when she left the marital home. Now, there came a point where she needed to talk to John about what they were going to do next. Were they going to get divorced? What was going to happen with Julian? Who was going to look after him? Living arrangements and all of that kind of thing and so on. So in the book, she talks about this day where she turns up to her old marital home, her former marital home, to talk to John about all of this stuff, which is really important. And Yoko's there. To paraphrase Cynthia in the book, she says she sat there on the sofa and Yoko was just sitting there, motionless, expressionless, all dressed in black, I think she said. And she said she was looking at John and it was like it was somebody else. He was completely devoid of any kind of personality. It looked like he was almost under some kind of spell. And she couldn't really get much out of him. He was just sitting there almost like he was some kind of zombie almost. Now, there are many other instances where I can give you where there is kind of, evidence that John was under some kind of mind control. I can fast forward this to around 1975. Now, what happened was sometime around 1973, John and Yoko split. And Yoko threw John out of the Dakota and said to him, right, go off and do your own thing. I don't want you around here.
Didn't she assign him a new girlfriend? Like she said,
yes.
Oh, and here's your new girlfriend.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing, which is just, who does that kind of thing? I mean, who does that? I mean, it's like, what wife or husband says, right, get out of my house. I don't want anything to do with you. Oh, and take this woman or take this man with you. And what? It's just, now, could it be that she was, and this woman was May Pang. And May Pang has spoken about this countless times. She's even made a film about it, written a couple of books about it. May Pang worked for John and Yoko. She was effectively John and Yoko's assistant, secretary, go-to kind of assistant who would get things done for them. She worked in John and Yoko's office. And according to May as well, yeah, Yoko approached May and said, look, I'm leaving John. Yoko said to May effectively, and I want you to accompany him. I don't know. Doesn't that sound a bit like a handler? I don't know. Anyway, so for what happened over the next 18 months, John and Yoko have described as John Lennon's lost weekend. 18 months in which, according to the official narrative, the official John and Yoko love story, this 18-month period where John was thrown out by Yoko and went off with May Pang, according to the official story, this 18-month period, John later dubbed his lost weekend. It was a weekend of despair, of depression, of angst, of just where he fell into this deep abyss of alcoholism, just a constant drug taking, all because he missed Yoko so much and he just couldn't face up to the pain of being without his precious Yoko. So he fell into this pit of alcoholism and constant drug use, and he became pretty much just like just a, a shadow of his former self, if you like. Now, May Pang has said that is absolute bull, because she claims that if this was John's lost weekend, how is it that in this 18-month period, in this so-called lost weekend, he managed to record 2 albums, the Walls and Bridges album and also the rock and roll album? He produced an album for his friend Harry Nilsson called Pussycats. He recorded a #1 single with David Bowie, which was Fame. And he also enjoyed a #1 hit with Elton John, which was Whatever Gets You Through the Night, which appeared on John Lennon's Walls and Bridges album. Also at this time, May says, a lot of the people that John had split from in the wake of him going out with Yoko, people from the 60s that he hung around with when he was with the Beatles, he began forming relationships with again. And one of those people was Paul McCartney, whether you believe that to be Paul or not. The case is that, according to May, and there's evidence of this bitter Beatles split that occurred in 1970, which was acrimonious to the point that basically what happened when the Beatles split, Paul took the other 3 Beatles to court to break their partnership, because they were tied together by their company Apple. Paul wanted to dissolve this partnership. So the split was bitter. It was acrimonious, and John and Paul were taking swipes at each other in the media during the early 70s. And what happened was, during this so-called lost weekend, as May says, is John and Paul actually began to form a relationship again. And it looked like there was going to be a Beatles reunion. And according to May, what happened was, sometime around early 1975, I think it was January 1975, just some weeks before John went back to Yoko, John turned to May and said, "What would you think if I started writing with Paul again?" And May says, "Are you serious? What do I think? Do it. Come on, do it." So basically what happened was, to cut a long story short, John Lennon bought some tickets to fly to New Orleans in January of 1975 to meet up with Paul. Paul was in New Orleans recording an album with his band Wings, an album which was to become Venus and Mars. And this isn't an allegation. This isn't some, claim that is unsubstantiated. There's actually, I think it was Derek Taylor, who was the Beatles' former press manager. I think it's in his book, and I think you can find it online. There's an actual postcard from John that John sends to Derek Taylor, in which he says he's flying over to meet with Paul. Now, what happened was, sometime around, I think it was the weekend that he was due to fly there, or he was going to fly over to New Orleans just after the weekend. But sometime around that weekend, May claims that John got a phone call from Yoko, in which she said to John, she said to John that she'd found him a hypnotist who could help him to stop smoking. And all he needed to do basically was to go over to the Dakota and see this quote unquote hypnotist. So John said, okay. And May and May has spoken about this, and she wrote about it in one of her books, one of her memoirs. I think it's in her memoirs, Loving John. And May remembers feeling very uneasy about this and saying to John that she didn't feel that this didn't sit quite right with her. And she said to him, she said to John, "Look, I don't think you should go. Something's not quite right here." And John said to her, "No, it's okay. It's going to be fine. I'm just going to go over there. I'm going to go over to the Dakota for a few hours and I'll be back." Now, there are 2 versions of this story, according to May. There's one version where John went to the Dakota and didn't come back until hours later. And then there's another version in which she says that he went to the Dakota and didn't come back at all for the whole weekend, and that she didn't see him again until Monday. But in whichever version she's given over the decades, the result is the same. When she saw John again, she said he was like a zombie, and his attitude to Paul McCartney was like he'd gone back in a time machine, and he'd gone back to the early 70s when all this acrimony was going on, and It was like he'd gone back to that time when he was squabbling with Paul and he wasn't getting on with him, where to the point where he said to in one of the versions. In one of the versions, John was away for a few hours and he returned and he was different. In the other version, she claims that she didn't see him again until Monday, when they both booked an appointment to go and see a dentist. And she saw him at the dentist's office and she said he was almost like a zombie. And yeah, as I say, in whatever version of events you go with, John's attitude to Paul and a Beatles reunion was just completely, it was scuppered. He had no interest in it. And when she saw John at the dentist, she says they walked back to their flat. He packed his bags and he returned that day to Yoko Ono. There's also an instance that took place I think it was in Holland. I think it was in 1970. And again, it's to do with a hypnotist. What happened then was, I think this was around the time that Yoko had just divorced her first husband, Anthony Cox. And Yoko and Anthony Cox had a child together who they named Kyoko. And Anthony was seeing someone at the time. I think he was going to get married to, or he was newly married to a woman by the name of Melinda. And he invited John and Yoko to come over to, I think it was Holland, if I'm not too mistaken. My memory's playing tricks with me, but I think it might have been Holland. But sometime in early 1970, January 1970, John and Yoko flew over to Anthony's and Melinda's home. I think it was in Holland. And whilst they were there, Anthony said to John that he knew of a hypnotist who could get rid of his smoking habit. So what is it with hypnotists and smoking habits in John Lennon? So John said, okay, let's give this a go. And John has talked about this. He's talked about this in an interview, in one or two interviews. So what happened was, he met up with this guy. This hypnotist was a guy by the name of Donald Hamrick. Now, when you look at Donald Hamrick's history, Donald Hamrick was the leader of a commune which was called the Harbingers Commune. And the Harbingers Commune has been linked to a CIA operation, which in itself is linked to the mind control program MKUltra. And essentially, I can't remember the name of the operation, but basically the Harbingers Commune, this hippie commune somewhere in California, I think it was, has been linked to the CIA mind control program MKUltra, and also to a secret program which was there basically it was kind of like COINTELPRO. It was there to undermine the anti-Vietnam and anti-US government movements and organizations that were going on in the early 70s and late 1960s. And this was very much what John was involved with at the time, of course, in the late 60s, early 70s. He was very much involved in that anti-Vietnam, anti-US administration kind of milieu, if you like. He was involved in all of that sort of quote unquote radicalism at the time. Now, there's a book by Albert Goldman that came out in 1988, which is called The Lives of John Lennon, a very controversial book, but very well researched. And in this book, Goldman claims that he talks about, he mentions Donald Hamrick in his book, and he says that Hamrick was involved in this UFO alien human agenda, where he was trying to push forth an agenda that married together UFOs and aliens and visitations with humans. Now, taking all this into account, when John met with this Donald Hamrick guy on the behest of Anthony Cox, so taking all of this into account, into context, so the way that John remembers it, and this is according to an interview, at least one or two interviews that John has given, he was sitting in a room and Donald Hamrick was trying to hypnotize John. Now, John claims that Hamrick didn't succeed in hypnotizing him. Well, certainly he didn't succeed in stopping him from smoking, because he continued to smoke right up until the end of his life. But what if Donald Hamrick didn't succeed in that, but maybe that wasn't Donald Hamrick's agenda. Maybe he was using that as a ruse in order to get John into a room so he could hypnotize him. But maybe there was something else going on. Maybe there was some other ulterior motive, and maybe this alien agenda had something to do with it. Now, as John recalls it, he was sitting in this room. Donald Hamrick was unsuccessfully, according to John, trying to hypnotize him. And then John says, as this was going on, two people suddenly walked into the room. And I think it was one or both of them he referred to as magicians who were trying to put spells on everybody. Now, also, according to Albert Goldman in his book, Albert Goldman claims that Anthony Cox's girlfriend cum wife, Melinda, who I mentioned earlier, was also a member of this CIA MK Ultra front Harbingers commune. According to Goldman, Anthony Cox's wife, Yoko Ono's ex-husband's wife or girlfriend, was involved with this MK Ultra mind control front, this Harbingers commune. And she was also, according to Goldman, a practicing witch. Now, the scenario, the possibility that I put forward in the video is, what if John was actually successfully, he might not have thought it, but maybe he was successfully hypnotized. And maybe this magician that walked in and was putting spells on everybody was actually Melinda, but he didn't recognize it to be Melinda. Now, also, according to Albert Goldman, Melinda was actually, according to Goldman, he claims that Donald Hamrick enlisted the help of Melinda in order to use her close relationship with the Lennons in order to attract Lennon towards this alien agenda that Hamrick was trying to push into the public arena. And it could just well be, as I suggest in the video, that Melinda was there to facilitate that by, whether it's by casting spells, as John says, or whether through the hypnotism. But also, according to Goldman, he claims that Hamrick wanted John Lennon and the Beatles to push this alien agenda because he saw how successful the Beatles had been in pushing LSD, popularizing LSD with the wider public during the 1960s, and also how successful they'd been in pushing transcendental meditation and so-called Eastern mysticism through their relationship with the Maharishi. So what Hamrick was thinking, so Goldman claims in his book, The Lives of John Lennon, is that Hamrick wanted the Beatles. He thought that the Beatles or John Lennon could push his alien agenda as well as successfully as they had done with those other ways and means of living life and other agendas that they'd pushed so successfully in the 60s. So this hypnotism, which was under the guise of stopping John from smoking, was actually, it had an ulterior motive. So I mean, there's other examples I can give where it looks like John Lennon might have been mind controlled, but those are some of you. There's some for you there. If you want me to carry on, I can. But it's just
I'm sure
it
you
goes
could.
on and on and on. It's just so many, you know.
Yeah, I'm sure you could. I'm sure you could, Matt, because it's extensive. And some of the names that you mentioned there, I was intrigued. So I had a brief look into them. So May Pang was one that I looked into. I found out that she actually ended up marrying a man called Anthony Visconti. The Visconti were a noble Milanese family. So this is, again, blue blood. So one of the very first tarot decks was the Visconti Sforza tarot deck. And this man that May Pang ended up marrying, Anthony Visconti, became a worldwide famous music producer for David Bowie, for the Dandy Warhols, for all kinds of people. So it's amazing when you look into these people. They're all interconnected. They're all coming from the upper echelons, and they're all involved in what I would call social engineering. I think it's kind of unequivocal at this point that that's what we were seeing. And for some reason, John Lennon, I guess, didn't quite make the cut. At some point, they got rid of him. But I think that's a great place to pause for part number one, Matt. Believe it or not, we've already hit an hour. So before we go into part two, where we're going to be discussing more of what you discussed in your video, actually, is what I want to get into, because there's some more things we can pull out from that recent release, the remastered version of John Lennon's Mind Games, because it actually came in a giant black cube. I don't know if you mentioned that in the
No,
video.
I don't. No.
I don't remember you saying
that's
it.
That's over £1,000 or over $1,000 to buy that.
Yeah. The super deluxe version comes in a giant black cube, which immediately I was like, geez, they're laying it on here. But yeah, we'll get into that in part number 2, Matt. But where can listeners find you? And of course, I'll put the links in the description anyways. But is there anywhere where you want me to direct people?
Well, if no one's had more than enough after all that, me rabbiting on, and there's my website, Conspiro Media, which takes a look these days over the last kind of, I don't know, sort of since 2016, I've been looking at the so-called London counterculture of the 1960s for evidence of it being social engineering. So a lot of the videos and articles on that site are to do with that since 2016. It was launched in 2012, but since 2016, that's what it's about. You can find that at conspiromedia.wordpress.com. There's also my site, The Occult Beatles, also theoccultbeatles.wordpress.com. There's also Conspiro Media Facebook, where you can find an amalgamation of both those sites and then extra stuff. And there's my YouTube page, which is Conspiro TV. I'm also on Rumble and Odyssey as well. And there's a Spreaker page too, Conspiro Media by Matt. So these are the places that you can find me. Yeah, and I'll be waiting for you.
Cheers for that, Matt. Yeah,
they're waiting.
Listeners, please go support Matt's work if you can. If you can donate to his cause, he's a fantastic researcher. He's been on the show 3 times, like I said, episode 23, 35, and 43. And we've done hours of discussion on these topics. We spoke about the Fabians, the counterculture, moreover. So you've brought some great research to the table over here, and you can find those episodes too on the YouTube page. I've actually got a new YouTube channel just for the podcast, Parallel Mic Podcast. So I'm going to put these ones up as well, Matt, to go with this one. And one more time, a big thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to part number 2.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
What you are basically, deep down, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you the people have the power.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.